Hello there, friends. I'm Mark Thomas. Welcome to this opportunity to study the Bible with me. Now, I want to look at this chapter in 1 Corinthians that we've got to in our series of studies through 1 Corinthians. We've got to chapter 7, and I want to offer you just 4 really short videos as we work our way through this chapter. A fascinating chapter that both sounds very controversial to some ears and also very common to others. It's perhaps shocking for some, or perhaps perfectly normal for others. So I wonder how you read this passage and how you hear these words from the Apostle Paul. Well, let's dive into them. I'm just going to share my screen for a moment and welcome you to this study. So we're studying the book of 1 Corinthians, and throughout this we've discovered, haven't we, that Paul challenges believers to examine every area of life through the lens of the gospel. And he does this by, in a sense, presenting 5 chunky sections that deal with a variety of different things going on in the Corinthian church. In the first 4 chapters, if you were following those studies, we looked at the various divisions that there were in the church, which caused him great concern. He was very anxious about those, but he offered a gospel solution, and that was to remind the believers in Corinth, and to remind us too, that Christ is the center and focus and foundation of our faith, and that in a sense should be a unifying factor for us to overcome the divisions that he had heard about and was aware of in the Corinthian church, and sadly continue to appear in churches in our day too. So chapters 1 to 4 is very relevant to us, and chapters 5 to 7 also address some very practical issues as he deals with some of the sins within the church, because a lack of spiritual wisdom in his eyes led to grievous sin. And various issues are dealt with in chapters 5 and 6. Chapter 5, he deals with the case of incest. In chapter 7, in chapter 5, he deals with the case of incest. In chapter 6, he deals with the matter of lawsuits between Christians and calls them to be resolved without reference to the courts. And also at the end of chapter 6, he reminds the Corinthians that immorality is incompatible with union with Christ. And the solution that he offers to all of these is to remind the believers that the Christian community requires holiness. We are to be a holy people in response to a holy God, and our relationship to Christ should manifest itself in holiness. So in chapter 7, what we get to here is a fascinating chapter, as I say. So let's just spend a few minutes diving into it. I really encourage you to read verses 1 to 9. So pause the video at this point, read verses 1 to 9, and we'll note that it addresses both married and unmarried couples and reminds them of the need to pursue God's calling in their lives. So pause the video and read the passage. How did you get on with the passage? Interesting read. What do we have in this? Well, having written of the dangers that he sees in the way the Corinthian church had tolerated sin within its community, Paul now begins a new section in which he takes up concerns that the Corinthians have raised in a letter that they've sent to him. You see that in verse 1. Now for the matters you wrote about. It seems likely that given his use of the introductory formula now concerning, both here in chapter 7, verse 1, and it's also repeated in chapter 8, verse 1, notice, and then turn over the page in your Bible to chapter 12, verse 1, you'll see he uses the same introductory formula, now concerning. And that leads us to think that perhaps the questions that the Corinthians had for Paul fell into 3 broad categories. Firstly, matters related to marriage and celibacy in chapter 7. We'll get into that in a moment. Then in chapters 8 onwards, matters related to idolatry. That's a section from chapter 8 through to chapter 11, because then in chapter 12, again, he introduces another matter now concerning, and that's related to the use of spiritual gifts. That's a section from chapters 12 to 14, and we'll get to that in due course as well. But into the discussion in chapter 7 of marriage and celibacy, he incorporates a variety of teaching on such things as remaining single, on the place of widows, on being married to a non-believer, on divorce, and at the heart of the message, on remaining in the same status that you were at the time of your conversion. That seems to me the overarching message of this chapter. So, though the subject is new in this book, in 1 Corinthians, nevertheless, there are themes and ideas that were previously introduced and are picked up in this passage and provide a degree of continuity with what he's already said. So Paul remains concerned about, well, the temptation to sexual immorality. He's concerned about their understanding of the place of God's gifts and the grace gifts that God gives. And he's also concerned about a person's calling. You see that especially in verses 17 to 24, and we'll come to those in the next video. However, the tone of this section, even though is picking up on themes that he'd already written about, the tone is rather different. So gone are the rhetorical questions, do you know, have you heard type questions. Rather, there is a more subtle tone here. And some of the matters about which they have written do indeed require serious addressing. But Paul is also concerned to demonstrate that all Christians have a responsibility to follow the life for which the Lord has gifted them. So Paul has voiced great concern about those in the congregation who seem to be spiritually arrogant, who regard themselves as spiritually superior to others. And in this passage in particular, it appears that some of those may have held a form of asceticism, which required certain behaviors to be dispensed with, including matters relating to marriage and singleness. And they regarded such matters that affected the body and involved the body as being non-spiritual. And Paul wants to address that and basically knock that idea on the head. So let me just share my screen for a second so that you can see the simple structure of this passage. My screen sharing on, here it is. And as I say, generally verses 1 to 9 are addressing the issue of married and unmarried, pursuing God's calling on their lives. And there are 3 sections here. So married couples and sexual relations, he addresses in verses 1 to 5. He comments on the matter of sexual temptation, and he closes the argument, verses 1 to 5 really, where it starts effectively by saying, because of sexual immoralities, we see that in verse 2, and he closes with, lest Satan tempt you in verse 5. These verses are carefully balanced as both husband and wife are addressed alternatively. That's followed with a personal note from the Apostle Paul in verses 6 and 7, where Paul talks of his preference for remaining single. And that then forms a bridge into the third section, which I notice on the screen I've got down as verses 7 and 8, but it should be really verses 8 and 9. And in verses 8 and 9 begin with Paul drawing attention to his authority. And here he addresses unmarried people, including widows. And what Paul says, both to the single person in verse 8 and to those marrying in verse 9, that either remaining single or marrying are options available to the unmarried. Again, the section ends with a reference to sexual temptation, because Paul's desire is that we should pursue God's calling to be a holy people. And so what's the summary of this, these verses? Well, I've got it down here. This is the summary. In response to a matter raised by the Corinthians, suggesting that some among them regarded sexual abstinence in marriage as the more spiritual way to live, and therefore should be adopted, Paul insists that they face up to temptations to immorality, and he affirms the value and mutuality of sexual relations within marriage partnerships and of self-control for the unmarried. And so this is, as I say, both something that might sound very challenging to some or very normal to others. But I think this summarizes what Paul says in chapter 7, verses 1 to 9. So thanks very much for joining me. If you want to check the next section in chapter 7, join me in the next video. But thanks very much for your time. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care. God bless.